The dark before the fire, you're lying there right now, aren't you? Comfortable, warm, maybe a little too warm. There's a pillow under your head, a blanket pulled up to your chin, the blue glow of this screen the only light in the room. And you're doing the thing you do at this hour, the thing where sleep won't quite come, so you reach for a voice to help you down into it. That's fine. I do the same thing. But here's what I want you to think about before we go anywhere together tonight. I want you to think about what it took, what it actually took in the most concrete, physical, unromantic sense for a human being to survive a single night on this planet. Not 100,000 years ago. I mean last night, the night before that, every night for the last 3 million years of our existence, with only the last 12,000 of those years spent in anything we'd recognize as a settled, agricultural, semi-predictable world. For most of human history, for the overwhelming, yawning, barely imaginable majority of it, nightfall wasn't a soft signal to wind down. It was a threat. It was the moment the world became genuinely dangerous in ways that required every physiological and social resource your ancestors had. The darkness didn't just invite sleep. It invited predators. It invited cold. It invited the kind of silence that meant something was watching. And yet, here you are. Which means every single one of your ancestors made it through. Every one. In an unbroken chain stretching back to before our species had a name for itself, someone survived long enough to have children, who survived long enough to have children, who survived long enough to eventually, improbably, produce you lying in your warm room, wondering if you should turn the screen brightness down. I find that genuinely moving, not in a cheesy way. In the way that makes you want to understand exactly how it happened. So that's what we're going to do tonight. My name is, well, you know who I am. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel is called The Sleepless Historian, and the deal we have is a simple one. I tell you stories about the past, and you let them carry you somewhere quieter than where you started. We go slow. We go deep. We don't skip the hard parts, because the hard parts are usually where the human beings are. If you've been here before, you know the rhythm. If you're new, just settle in. This one is going to take a while, and that's on purpose. And if at some point in the next few hours you find yourself drifting, if the voice starts to blur and the images start to soften at the edges, that's the whole point. Don't fight it. This story will be here when you wake up. If you'd like to subscribe before we dive in, the button is right there. I never push it hard because I think if the work is good enough, you'll come back on your own. That's the only test that matters to me. All right, let's go. Let's go back to before there was anything to go back to. Before fire, the long dark before we were us. Let me start by breaking something that you probably half believe without realizing it. When people talk about early humans surviving, they usually imagine something heroic, something muscular and decisive, spears and fire and painted caves. They imagine a kind of noble struggle, a clean contest between human ingenuity and a hostile world, with ingenuity winning in the end through sheer grit. The reality is both stranger and quieter than that. The earliest members of our genus Homo habilis, walking the savannas of East Africa somewhere around 2.3 to 1.4 million years ago, were not the dominant creatures of their landscape. They were not even close to the top of the food chain. They were, by every available measure, smallish, relatively slow-footed, poorly equipped by nature for either offense or defense, and living in an environment that included some of the most efficient predators that have ever existed on this planet. They were prey. Not always, not only, not as a defining permanent condition, but they were absolutely prey. The fossil record doesn't let us pretend otherwise. Here's what I mean. Paleoanthropologist Robert Blumenskine, working in the 1980s through the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, conducted a series of studies on what he called confrontational scavenging, the idea that early hominins may have survived in part by following large predators, watching where lions and hyenas made kills, and then moving in opportunistically to claim what was left. Not hunting, scavenging, taking the leavings of animals that could have killed them without pausing. Blumenstein's work suggested that early Homo was filling a niche somewhere between predator and prey, which is a terrifying place to be, and also, it turns out, a genuinely clever one. And here's the detail that gets me every time. Blumenstein studied what bones looked like after different animals had worked on them. Lion teeth marks look a certain way. Hyena teeth marks look a different way. And hominin stone tool cut marks, the distinctive angled scraping patterns left when someone used a simple flaked rock to strip meat from bone, look a particular way too. When he found bones with both large predator marks and hominin tool marks, he could often tell from the sequence which came first. In many cases, the predator marks were on top. That means the hominins got there first. Which means there were individuals, actual named by nothing, unremembered people, the first people, who looked at a freshly killed zebra carcass and made the decision to run toward it before the lions arrived, to grab what they could, to get out. Think about what that takes, not just courage in some abstract sense. Actual, moment-to-moment physical computation. How close are the lions? Which direction is the wind? How fast can I move with whatever I can carry? What happens to my family if I don't come back? These were not thoughtless decisions. They were the decisions of creatures already well on their way to becoming us. But let's go even further back for a moment, because I think it matters to understand just how strange and long the runway is. Before Homo habilis, before anything we'd call human even in the loosest sense, our lineage goes back through the Australopithecines, creatures like Australopithecus afarensis, the species to which the famous Lucy skeleton belongs. Lucy was discovered in 1974 by Donald Johanson and his team in the Afar region of Ethiopia. She dates to approximately 3.2 million years ago. She was around 4 feet tall. She walked upright, which is remarkable and important, but her brain was roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. She lived in a world of large predatory cats, crocodiles, hyenas, enormous extinct baboons, and at least one species of massive eagle that, the fossil record suggests, may have preyed specifically on small hominins. There's a skull of a young Australopithecus africanus, a member of a related species, discovered in the Tong limestone quarry in South Africa in 1924 by Raymond Dart. This skull, which became one of the most famous fossils in the history of paleoanthropology, was that of a child, maybe 3 years old. And when researchers in 2006 looked at the damage patterns around the eye sockets and the back of the skull, they concluded that the child had most likely been killed and carried away by a large bird of prey, probably a crowned eagle, before being dropped, the carcass eventually fossilizing in that quarry. The child's name, if it had one, if the concept of a name existed then, is lost to 3 million years of geology. But that child existed. Someone, something, noticed when it was gone. I think about that sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep, the specific weight of that. So this is where survival begins, not with clever tools or fire or language. It begins at the absolute bottom of possibility, with small-brained, upright walking creatures navigating an environment that actively, routinely wanted to kill them. And they made it. Generation after generation, for millions of years, they made it. How? The short answer is community. The longer answer is community plus a series of biological and behavioral innovations that we're still only partially understanding, accumulated so slowly that slow doesn't quite capture it. These weren't decades of change. They were hundreds of thousands of years of incremental pressure and incremental response, filtered through the brutal arithmetic of who lived long enough to pass on what. Let's talk about what we know for certain. The first thing early hominins had going for them was bipedalism, walking upright on two legs. This seems obvious and almost boring when I say it, but the implications are worth sitting with. Bipedalism freed the hands. Freed hands meant things could be carried, things could be examined, things could be thrown. It also, interestingly, made hominins more efficient long-distance travelers than many quadrupeds, not faster over short distances, but capable of covering more ground over time with less energy expenditure, particularly in the heat of the African day. This may have been a crucial advantage. Large predators, particularly big cats, are not adapted for sustained activity in midday heat. Hominins might have had a window of relative safety in the hottest part of the day that most other animals did not. The second thing was social structure. Hominins, as far back as we can trace, lived in groups. Not the massive, fluid aggregations of some herbivores, but consistent, relatively stable social units, probably something like the multi-family bands you see in modern hunter-gatherer societies, ranging from around 20 to 50 individuals, depending on resource availability. This matters for survival in ways that compound rapidly. More eyes see more threats. More adults can defend against some attacks. More individuals means that childcare can be distributed, which matters enormously for a species with the extended juvenile dependency that hominins began to develop as brains enlarged and birth became harder and more dangerous. The third thing, and this is the one that I think gets underappreciated, is omnivory. Early hominins weren't committed to any single food strategy. They ate plant matter, tubers, seeds, fruits, insects, eggs, marrow extracted from bones, small animals when they could catch them, and meat when they could either hunt or scavenge it. This flexibility is not a character trait, it's a survival engine. In an environment where any one food source might fail, drought-killing vegetation, competition excluding you from prime scavenging spots, seasonal shifts making certain resources temporarily unavailable, the ability to pivot is everything. The species that are most specialized are often the first to go when conditions change. The ones that can make do with almost anything tend to hang on. Homo sapiens is the most extreme omnivore that has ever lived. That's not an accident. Now I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in the standard narrative of human survival, the role of sleep itself. Because here's the thing. For a small, relatively defenseless creature living in an African landscape full of nocturnal predators, sleeping is genuinely dangerous. You're unconscious or something close to it. You're unaware of your surroundings. You're slow to respond. And if you're sleeping on the ground, you are, in the most literal possible sense, lying down in a place where things that want to eat you also walk. So why do we sleep at all? Why does any animal sleep at all, given that it is, from a pure survival standpoint, a period of absolute vulnerability? This is a question that evolutionary biology has been arguing about for decades, and the honest answer is that we still don't fully know. What we do know is that sleep is not optional. Animals that are experimentally deprived of sleep die faster than animals deprived of food. The brain requires sleep to function at any meaningful level. Memory consolidation, emotional regulation, immune function, cellular repair, all of these are critically dependent on sleep. This means that whatever the evolutionary pressures against sleep, the pressures for it were greater. Sleep wasn't a luxury that got selected in. It was a necessity that survival couldn't do without. But for early hominins, the question wasn't just do we sleep? It was where and how and in what configuration, and what do we do about the things that move in the dark? Anthropologist David Sampson, working with colleagues at Duke University, published research in 2017 in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology examining the sleep patterns of the Hadza, a contemporary hunter-gatherer group in Tanzania who are, in certain important ways, living in ecological conditions closer to those of ancestral humans than most people on Earth. What Sampson and his colleagues found is both deeply informative and, I think, quietly beautiful. The Hadza, when monitored with actigraphy wrist sensors over a period of 20 days, showed a striking pattern. Not everyone in the group slept at the same time. Within a given night, there were almost always several individuals awake, naturally, without any assigned watch schedule, simply because individual sleep timing varied across adults due to differences in age, health, sex, and individual chronotype. Over a given hour of nighttime, across the whole group, the researchers estimated that the odds of everyone being asleep simultaneously was vanishingly small. They calculated it happened for fewer than 18 minutes per night on average. Sampson called this the sentinel hypothesis. The idea is that the natural variation in human sleep timing may itself be a survival adaptation, a built-in staggering of who's awake when, providing collective vigilance without requiring anyone to formally sacrifice their sleep. Older adults who tend to wake earlier and sleep lighter may have served as natural early sentinels. Younger adults who tend toward later sleep timing would be more alert in the later hours of the night. I've thought about this a lot, and I want to be honest with you. It's one of those findings that makes me genuinely emotional in a way I have a hard time explaining. There's something in it about how we are made, how the very biology of sleep, the thing that makes some of us night owls and some of us early birds, the thing that causes you to wake at 3 a.m. and lie there while your partner sleeps, all of that might be a very old gift. Might be the shape of something our ancestors did unconsciously to keep each other alive. The grandparent who can't sleep past 5, the teenager who can't close their eyes before midnight. They're not broken. They might be the exact right configuration for a species that needed to keep watch. Now, where did early hominins actually sleep? This is a question where the fossil and archaeological record has some genuinely exciting things to tell us, though fair warning, the picture is incomplete in ways that are frustrating and will probably always remain so. Sleep leaves few traces. It's one of the most ephemeral behaviors imaginable. What archaeologists look for instead are the proxies, hearth sites, bedding materials, spatial organization of dwelling sites that suggests regular use over time. The oldest confirmed evidence of intentional bedding, not just sleeping in a natural hollow, but actually constructing a place to sleep, comes from a site called Wonderwerk Cave in the Lebombo Mountains of South Africa, on the border between South Africa and Eswatini. In 2020, a team led by paleoanthropologist Lynn Wadley published research in the journal Science analyzing plant material from Wonderwerk Cave dating to approximately 200,000 years ago. They found compacted layers of sedge grass, Cyperus species, that appeared to have been deliberately gathered and arranged into sleeping mats. The grass was layered in a way consistent with being replaced and refreshed over time. and crucially, some of it had been burned, suggesting these sleeping areas were periodically cleaned by fire, which would have helped control insects and parasites. 200,000 years ago, someone was making their bed, not just sleeping where they fell, choosing a grass, gathering, arranging it, maintaining it, burning the old material to start fresh. That's a behavioral sophistication that implies a mental model of comfort, of hygiene, of home. It implies that sleep was understood as something worth preparing for, that the quality of the surface you lay down on was worth the labor of improving it. And once you've got that, once you've got the concept of a home base, of a place you return to, of a surface you tend, you've got something that changes everything about how survival works. You've got a fixed point around which social structure can organize. You've got a place where food can be brought and shared. You've got a place to leave the young while adults forage. You've got the faint beginning of something like home. But let's back up to before the grass beds, because I don't want to give you the impression that 200,000 years ago was anywhere close to the beginning of this story. The question of where very early hominins slept is one that researchers have been trying to answer using comparative primatology, looking at what our closest living relatives do and inferring from that what our common ancestors might have done. And what they've found is both sobering and clever. Chimpanzees build nests every night. Almost without exception, adult chimpanzees build fresh sleeping nests in trees, usually at heights of between 4 and 15 meters off the ground. These nests are constructed of branches and foliage, taking somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes to build, and they're largely abandoned the next morning. A new nest will be built the next night, usually in a different location. Anthropologist Fiona Stewart, working with colleagues from the University of Cambridge and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, conducted detailed studies of chimpanzee nesting behavior in Uganda and Tanzania and found that these nests are not crude or careless. Chimpanzees select specific tree species, preferring those with the combination of structural integrity and leaf softness that makes for a stable, comfortable platform. They monitor nest quality. They sometimes return to a particularly good nest site repeatedly. Now here's the interesting implication. The common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees, who lived approximately 6 to 7 million years ago, almost certainly did something similar. And the Australopithecines, Lucy and her kind, 4 feet tall, bipedal, but with long arms and curved fingers that suggest they were still quite comfortable in trees, probably slept in trees much of the time, for the same reason chimpanzees do. It's simply much safer than sleeping on the ground. The transition to ground sleeping, which is genuinely unusual among primates, probably required fire. Or at minimum, it was enabled by fire in a way that made it consistently safer. And that brings us to the most transformative technology in the history of human survival. Fire the night we changed, I want to tell you about a discovery made in a place called Wonderwerk Cave, in the northern Cape province of South Africa, in the arid country of the southern Kalahari. Wonderwerk means miracle in Afrikaans, which turns out to be an apt name. In 2012, a team of researchers led by Francesco Berna of Boston University published findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They had been working in Wonderwerk Cave for years, carefully analyzing sediment layers from deep inside the cave, layers that dated by radiometric methods to approximately 1 million years ago. In those layers, they found something remarkable: burned bone fragments, plant ash, microscopic silica structures, phytoliths from grass and leaves that had been burned at temperatures consistent with a campfire, not a wildfire. The sediment showed evidence not of a single burning event, but of multiple repeated use. 1 million years ago, in a cave, someone, probably Homo erectus, the species that preceded us by perhaps 700,000 years, was using fire inside a rock shelter in a regular, intentional way. Now here's where I need to be careful, because the question of when hominins first controlled fire, actually made and maintained it, rather than just using embers from natural wildfires, is one of the most contested in paleoanthropology, and I don't want to oversimplify it. The Wonderwerk evidence is strong for intentional fire use at 1 million years ago, but some researchers have argued for even earlier evidence, back to 1.5 million years ago in Kenya, at a site called Chesuania, though that evidence is debated. What most researchers agree on is that by around 1 million years ago, fire use was a consistent, established part of hominin behavior in at least some populations. But even setting aside the exact date, the implications are so profound that I want to spend some time really sitting inside them. Think about what fire does for survival. It provides warmth in cold environments, which expands the range of habitats hominins could occupy. It provides light, which extends the usable portion of the day and night and transforms the social life of the group. It deters predators. Nearly every large terrestrial predator that threatens primates has an evolved fear of fire. It's encoded at the neurological level in animals like lions and leopards. It can be used to drive game, to clear vegetation, to signal across distances. But perhaps the most underappreciated thing fire does, the thing that Harvard primatologist Richard Wrangham has argued compellingly in his book Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human, is cook food. Wrangham's hypothesis, developed over decades of research, is that cooking is not just a convenient addition to early hominin life. It's a driver of human evolution itself. When you cook food, you pre-digest it. You break down complex carbohydrates and proteins in ways that make far more caloric energy available to the body from the same amount of raw material. You kill pathogens that would otherwise cause disease. You make many foods that are indigestible or toxic in their raw state safe and nutritious. And you dramatically reduce the time required for chewing. Chimps spend somewhere between 4 and 7 hours a day chewing their raw food, because raw plant matter is tough and fibrous and requires enormous mechanical processing. Cooking makes food soft and calorie-dense, meaning you can get the same energy in far less time. Wrangham argues that the energetic surplus created by cooking, the extra calories available, because your gut didn't have to do all the work of breaking down raw food, is what funded the expansion of the human brain. Brain tissue is extraordinarily metabolically expensive. A human brain, which represents about 2% of body weight, consumes roughly 20% of our total caloric energy. You cannot build and run that organ on a raw diet without enormous trade-offs. But cook your food and suddenly the energy is there. This is not universally accepted. There are researchers who think Wrangham is overstating the case, or that other factors were more decisive in brain expansion. But even the skeptics generally acknowledge that cooking, once it became established, was profoundly transformative for human nutrition, health, and social organization. Because here's the other thing fire did. Here's the thing that doesn't show up in the caloric equation, but shows up everywhere in the anthropological record once you start looking for it. Fire created the evening. Before fire, the night was the enemy's time. Darkness meant predators and cold and the end of useful activity. With fire, the night became the most social part of the day. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner from the University of Utah spent decades working with the Kung San, a hunter-gatherer group of the Kalahari in Botswana and Namibia, and in 2014 published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that looked specifically at what people talked about around daytime fires versus nighttime fires. The results were striking. Daytime campfire conversation was dominated by practical matters, criticism, complaints about social behavior, economic discussions, local gossip about specific individuals' actions. It was, in Wiesner's framing, the conversation of a society managing its internal tensions, the necessary, somewhat grinding business of coordinating social life. Nighttime conversation around fires was something different entirely. It was dominated by storytelling. Specifically, stories about people and places beyond the immediate group, stories about ancestors, about heroic deeds, about the spirit world, about distant relatives, about great events of the past. It was, Wiesner argues, the conversation that builds a sense of shared identity stretching beyond the immediate moment and the immediate group. It's the conversation that creates culture, the transmitted, accumulated knowledge of who we are and where we come from. She found that roughly 81% of nighttime campfire talk consisted of these kinds of stories. 81%. So here's what that means. The evening campfire wasn't just where early humans stayed warm and avoided being eaten. It was probably, the context in which human storytelling, human mythology, human cultural memory all developed. The long nights around fire may be the origin of everything we mean when we talk about culture. Every novel ever written, every song ever sung, every religion ever conceived, every history ever recorded, all of it may trace back, however distantly, to those specific hours, that specific gathering in the dark, that specific impulse to tell each other who we were. And here's what gets me. You're listening to a story right now, late at night, in the dark. Some things don't change as much as we think. Let me tell you about a woman named Nanta. I'm going to call her that, though her actual name, if she had one in any sense we'd recognize, is lost beyond all possibility of recovery. She lived, as best as the evidence allows us to place her, somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa approximately 300,000 years ago. She was almost certainly a member of an archaic Homo sapiens population, not quite anatomically modern by today's standards, but close. Robust brow ridges, a skull slightly longer and lower than yours, but a brain volume comfortably within the modern human range, a social brain, a language-capable brain, probably, though we'll never know for certain. Let me tell you about Nanta's night. Not her specific night, I can't give you that. But a night reconstructed from everything we know, a composite of what the record says was real. Nanta sleeps on bedding, probably grass like the border cave evidence suggests was common, gathered, arranged, replaced periodically. She sleeps on the floor of a rock shelter or just inside the mouth of a cave at a site her group has been returning to for years, maybe decades. The rock holds warmth from the day's sun. The overhang blocks rain. The fire is a few meters away, close enough to feel, far enough not to be a danger. Someone is awake, not on formal watch. There's no word for that, no assigned duty. But Nanta's grandmother, or the older woman who fills that role in the band, is sitting up, the way older people sit up in the last hours of night, not quite awake enough to function, but too lightly asleep to stay down. Her eyes are open. They catch the fire's light. The night outside is full of sound. That's the thing that modern humans almost never experience, how loud the African night actually is. Frogs in the wet season, insects of extraordinary variety, the occasional distant call of a hyena, the sound, once or twice a night, of something large moving through the bush beyond the shelter's entrance. Nanta hears all of this and doesn't entirely wake. Her sleeping brain processes threat assessments it's been running for years, in this place at this time. It knows the sound signature of this specific landscape. It knows the difference between a hyena calling far away and the particular sound a large predator makes when it's close and interested. She doesn't have to think about this. Her brain does it for her while she sleeps. She wakes at some point in the night. This is normal for pre-modern sleep, as historian Roger Eckerch has documented extensively for medieval Europeans and as sleeping researchers believe was common for much of human history. A first sleep, a period of wakefulness, a second sleep. She lies in the dark for a while. She's not alone. There are bodies around her, the warmth of them, the sound of breathing. She hears the old woman shift by the fire. She probably doesn't go back to sleep immediately. She lies there in the particular state of nighttime wakefulness that feels, in every culture where it has been documented, like a different kind of consciousness. Not the sharp alertness of day, not the full absence of deep sleep, but something in between, something older. Some researchers have called this hypnagogic consciousness. Some indigenous traditions have called it the most honest part of the night, the time when the spirit is most present. What does Nanta think about? I'll tell you what I think. And this is honest speculation, but it's grounded in what we know about human cognition, human emotion, and human community structure. I think she thinks about the people around her. I think she thinks about the child she's keeping alive and whether she's doing it right. I think she thinks about what tomorrow's foraging might bring and where she last saw the tubers that were almost ready. I think she thinks in whatever pre-linguistic or proto-linguistic way available to her, about the person who died in this band 2 seasons ago, and about the absence that's still there, like a tooth socket that won't stop hurting. And I think she lies in the dark with all of that, in the dark that her grandmother's eyes are watching through, and eventually the second sleep comes for her, and she goes down into it, and the fire breathes slowly around her, and she makes it to morning. Let me spend a moment on something that I think is important to understand about fire and human survival, and that gets left out of the standard narrative because it's uncomfortable. Controlling fire requires fire. You have to get it somewhere before you can maintain it. For early hominins, for Homo erectus and the archaic human populations that followed, acquiring fire in the first place meant opportunistically collecting embers from natural fires, lightning strikes, volcanic activity, spontaneous grass fires in dry seasons. The next step, keeping that fire alive, is a job of extraordinary continuous commitment. You cannot let the fire go out. If it goes out and you don't know how to start a new one, you are back in the dark. The earliest reliable evidence for fire-making tools, for the deliberate production of fire from scratch rather than maintenance of already burning coals, dates to only about 400,000 years ago. Before that, for hundreds of thousands of years, possibly 1 million years or more, if hominins were using fire, they were using fire they hadn't started themselves. Think about that responsibility. The person in the group whose job, not by assignment, just by circumstance and skill, was to know where the fire-carrying vessel was, to make sure the coals stayed live, to know what to feed them and when, to know when the group was moving that you carried the fire with you in a ceramic vessel or a bundle of slow-burning fungus and you did not drop it. This is one of the most profound social responsibilities in the history of human survival, and it has no monument. It was just someone had to do it. Someone always did. ethnographic accounts from hunter-gatherer groups around the world, collected by anthropologists over the last 150 years, document fire carrying as a consistent practice wherever groups moved seasonally. Among the Tiwi of Australia's Melville Island, fire carrying was observed in the early 20th century as a routine part of seasonal movement. Among various Amazon basin groups studied by Napoleon Chagnon in the 1960s, fire was carried between campsites using slow smoldering bark. The Andaman Islanders, studied by E.H. Mann in the late 19th century, were described as having no knowledge of fire making at that time. Their fires had been maintained continuously through an unbroken chain of tending for as far back as their oral history reached. That is, if accurate, one of the most staggering things I know. A fire kept burning through human hands, passed forward through generations, for longer than recorded history extends, because no one knew how to start a new one. The flame that made you safe tonight is the one your grandmother kept. The predators in the dark. I want to talk for a few minutes about what early humans were actually afraid of, not in the vague dangers of the wild sense, but specifically, because specificity changes how you understand what survival cost. The African landscape of the Pleistocene, the epoch stretching from about 2.6 million years ago to 11,700 years ago, the period that encompasses almost all of hominin evolution, was dramatically more dangerous in terms of megafauna predator load than the Africa of today. And today's Africa is already the most predator-rich landscape on the planet. Let me give you some names. Dinofleas. An extinct Machaerodont cat, a saber-toothed cat of the subfamily Machaerodontini that went extinct approximately 1.4 million years ago. It was approximately the size of a modern jaguar, but built heavier, with semi-saber-like upper canines designed for dispatching prey through biting and holding. For a long time, fossil evidence suggested dinofleas may have been a specialized primate predator. Its fossils have been found at hominid sites in South Africa, and analyses of associated hominin remains showed bite patterns consistent with a predator that attacked the head and neck from behind, a technique particularly effective against upright walking bipeds who can't easily see what's approaching from behind in dense cover. I want to be honest with you. The idea that there was once, for over 1 million years, a cat specifically shaped in the evolutionary sense, shaped by millions of generations of successful hominin hunting, to kill and eat our ancestors is not something that I have ever been able to think about without feeling something in my nervous system respond. This wasn't a generic predator that would take a hominin if the opportunity arose. The fossil record suggests dinofleas was, functionally, the human's cat, the one that hunted us. Then there was Pachycrocuta, an extinct giant hyena that roamed Africa, Europe, and Asia until about 500,000 years ago. Pachycrocuta brevirostris had a shoulder height comparable to a modern lion and jaws capable of crushing the long bones of large ungulates, the leg bones of horses and buffalo, with ease. A single Pachycrocuta could destroy a kill site entirely, bones and all. And it was not afraid of fire. There was also, in many regions of the Pleistocene, the cave lion Panthera leospelea, a lion significantly larger than its modern counterpart, which survived until approximately 13,000 years ago and is depicted, remarkably vividly, in the cave paintings of southern France and northern Spain. The Chauvet Cave in the Ardèche, carbon dated to around 36,000 years ago, contains some of the most detailed Paleolithic artwork ever found, including extraordinary depictions of cave lions in active scenes, hunting, confronting prey, pairs moving together. The artists who made those paintings had clearly watched these animals extensively, in the specific way you watch something that you are simultaneously awed by and terrified of. And in Asia and parts of Europe, there were cave bears. Ursus speleus, up to 3.5 meters long. Dense evidence of cave bear use of caves, thousands of bones found in European cave systems, has created what amounts to a record of cohabitation between cave bears and Neanderthals, our closest hominin relatives, who were living in many of the same cave systems between 400,000 and 40,000 years ago. The evidence suggests that Neanderthals sometimes drove cave bears from their dens, using fire and coordinated group activity in order to occupy the caves themselves. The bear scratches are on the cave walls, and so are the ash deposits from Neanderthal fires. The story of who was sleeping where is written in the stone. Against all of this, against dinofleas and pachycrocuta, and cave lions and cave bears, early humans and their predecessors survived. They did it with community, with fire, with increasing cleverness about the use of terrain, with the development of increasingly sophisticated weapons, and with something else that I want to give proper attention to now, because I think it's one of the most underrated survival strategies in human prehistory. They did it by making noise. There's a concept in ecology called the landscape of fear, developed most extensively by Joel Brown at the University of Illinois Chicago, that describes how prey animals don't just respond to predators. They reorganize their entire use of landscape around the possibility of predators. Where they go when they go there, how long they stay, what they eat, all of this gets shaped by fear. The landscape itself becomes a map of risk, with areas of high danger avoided even when those areas contain food. For early hominins, the landscape of fear was omnipresent and urgent. But unlike most prey species, hominins had the capacity to actively shape the landscape of fear in their favor. Fire was the most powerful tool. A fire-lit area is, neurologically speaking, terrifying to most large predators. But noise was another tool, and specifically the loud, coordinated noise of a group. Louis Liebenberg, a South African anthropologist and expert in persistence hunting and tracking, has documented among the Kalahari San the practice of what he calls confrontational scavenging and mobbing, the use of loud noise, coordinated motion, and the throwing of objects to drive large predators off kills. This is not a fringe behavior. It's a systematic strategy. Groups of men will approach a lion or hyena kill, shouting, clapping, throwing stones, and the predators will, in many cases, leave. Not because humans are physically threatening to lions, but because the coordinated, unpredictable behavior of a group of upright primates that doesn't act like prey is cognitively disruptive to a predator that hunts by recognizable behavioral cues. Prey animals freeze, flee, or fight in predictable ways. A group of hominins advancing while making loud, irregular noises is none of those things. It's confusing, and confused predators often disengage. This is, I think, one of the reasons human vocal capacity evolved the way it did, not just for language, not just for social bonding, but for making terrifying amounts of noise in a coordinated way with other members of your group. We're extremely loud animals when we choose to be, and that is almost certainly not an accident. Let me end this chapter where it began, in the cave, in the specific darkness of a rock shelter in the African night, with a small fire and bodies nearby, and the sound of something large moving somewhere beyond the entrance. I want you to understand something about what fire meant experientially to the humans who first had it. Not just strategically, not just calorically, but experientially. Because I think this is something we've genuinely lost the ability to feel. We have never lived in real darkness, not even close. We flip a switch and the night disappears. We carry a phone that produces more lumens than a campfire in our pockets. We have never, in our lives, experienced a darkness so complete that it was impossible to navigate, that it erased all visual information entirely and replaced it with an infinity of potential threat. Early hominins who lived before fire and populations who lost access to fire, which happened and was catastrophic, lived in that darkness every night, every single night, for millions of years. Fire ended that. Fire created a zone of safety in the dark that was physical and real. It was warm. It produced light in which you could see faces, see hands, see whether the shapes at the edge of the shelter were familiar or not. It held the dark at arm's length. The first human who sat in firelight, the first member of our lineage who experienced that specific warmth and that specific light, and understood that the night was being held back, felt something. I don't know what they felt. I can't know. But I suspect it was something not entirely unlike what you feel right now on some nights when you pull the blanket a little closer and the room feels just small enough and just warm enough and just right. There's a word in Danish, hygge, that's been fashionable in English language media for the last decade or so, and it means something like the warm, safe, social comfort of a sheltered interior, the coziness of being inside, the particular pleasure of a contained, lit space while the cold or dark is outside. Hygge is approximately 800,000 years old, and we still know exactly what it feels like. The hunt, what it means to kill something to eat. I want to tell you something about hunting that the popular mythology gets wrong. The version of prehistoric hunting that most people carry around in their heads, the image of the muscular, spear-wielding man sprinting toward a mammoth, striking it down, returning home victorious with enough meat to last a week, is, at best, a highly compressed and sanitized version of an occasional event. At worst, it's a fantasy constructed by Victorian archaeologists who had very specific ideas about what heroic masculinity looked like, and couldn't quite resist projecting them onto the deep past. The reality of hunter-gatherer subsistence, which, again, is the closest living approximation we have to the lifestyle of anatomically modern humans for the first 200,000 years or so of our species' existence, is that hunting is hard. It fails more often than it succeeds. It is physically brutal even when it works. And in most populations that have been studied, it provides a smaller fraction of total caloric intake than plant foods do, even when it succeeds regularly. Let me put some numbers to this, because I think the numbers matter. Richard Leigh, an anthropologist from the University of Toronto, conducted detailed nutritional studies of the Kung San of the Kalahari beginning in the 1960s, and published his findings in a series of landmark papers, and in his 1979 book, The Kung San, Men, Women, and Work in a Foraging Society. He found that in this specific environment, during the time of his fieldwork, mongongo nuts alone, gathered primarily by women, provided approximately 50% of the total caloric intake of the group. Animal food, hunted primarily by men, provided approximately 30 to 40% of calories. The remaining dietary calories came from a variety of gathered fruits, roots, and other plant matter. This is in one of the harsher environments inhabited by hunter-gatherers. In more productive environments, riverine, coastal, woodland, the plant-to-animal ratio often shifts further toward plants, with animal food occasionally providing as little as 20% of calories in some groups. This is not to say that hunting was unimportant. It was vitally important. Animal protein and fat provide nutrients that plant foods alone cannot deliver in adequate quantity, and the nutritional contribution of hunted meat is out of proportion to its caloric share. And beyond nutrition, hunting held social and symbolic significance in virtually every hunter-gatherer culture we have studied. Hunted meat is almost always shared more broadly than gathered plant food, creating social bonds and obligations that extend the network of mutual support. But hunting is not the center of the story of human survival. It's one of the threads, and the threads are woven together. Let me tell you about persistence hunting, because I think it's one of the most remarkable things our species can do, and almost no one outside of anthropology knows it exists. The concept is simple. You run your prey to death. In practice, it looks like this. A hunter identifies an animal, classically, a kudu or a wildebeest or a gemsbok in the Kalahari context, and begins to follow it, not to sprint after it, not to close the gap immediately. Just to follow it at a jog and to not stop. The animal is faster over short distances, much faster. It can escape easily, but it cannot run continuously in the heat of the African midday because it pants to cool itself. Panting requires stopping. Stopping means the hunter, who sweats rather than pants, who is a uniquely efficient cooling machine in the heat, continues to close the distance. The animal sees the hunter, panics, bolts again. The hunter follows, again and again, over 2 hours. Over 4 hours, over 6. Eventually, the animal is so heat-stressed that it cannot flee. It stands trembling somewhere between exhaustion and hyperthermia, and the hunter comes close enough to use a spear. This is persistence hunting. It was documented ethnographically among the San, the Tarahumara of Mexico, various Aboriginal Australian groups, and others. In 2006, David Carrier, Dennis Bramble, and Daniel Lieberman published a study in the journal Nature, arguing that human anatomy is specifically adapted for this type of hunting, that the anatomy of our feet, our legs, our nuchal ligament, the cord of connective tissue that keeps our head stable during running, our gluteus maximus muscles, our relatively hairless and sweat gland-rich skin, all of it makes us, uniquely among primates, built to run long distances in heat. Lieberman from Harvard has spent much of his career studying this. His work suggests that the human body is not particularly well designed for anything in terms of brute strength or speed, but is extraordinarily well designed for one thing: sustained, efficient, heat-tolerant locomotion over long distances. We are, in other words, born distance runners. And for hundreds of thousands of years, possibly millions, that was one of our most important survival weapons. I want to tell you about Louis Liebenberg himself for a moment, because his work on tracking and persistence hunting is some of the most interesting research in human evolutionary biology, and he came to it through a genuinely unusual path. Liebenberg first went to the Kalahari in the early 1980s as a young man, driven by a specific question that had been nagging at him. What is the origin of scientific thinking? He'd come to believe that tracking, the art of reading animal signs to reconstruct behavior, was the first genuinely scientific practice of the human species. Not science in the formal, institutional sense, but science in the functional sense: hypothesis formation, evidence gathering, testing, revision. A tracker looking at footprints in the sand is forming a hypothesis about where an animal went, why it went there, how long ago, in what physical state. They are reading a text that requires both empirical observation and inferential imagination. When Liebenberg first asked experienced sand trackers if he could learn to track, they were initially skeptical. Tracking knowledge is extensive, built over a lifetime, and passed on within specific lineages. But they eventually agreed to teach him, and he spent years learning, eventually participating in persistence hunts. His book, The Art of Tracking: The Origin of Science, published in 1990, makes the argument that the cognitive operations required for skilled tracking, pattern recognition, cause and effect reasoning, mental modeling of another animal's behavior, hypothesis testing, are essentially the same cognitive operations that underlie scientific inquiry. Which means the hunter, following a set of prints across dry sand, reconstructing the animal's gait and pace and direction from the compression patterns and the spacing between impressions, that person is doing something that Isaac Newton did, that Marie Curie did, that every person who has ever framed a testable hypothesis has done. Science, on this reading, didn't begin in ancient Greece or 17th century Europe. It began in the Pleistocene, in the African grasslands, with a person who needed to figure out where the food went. I find that genuinely moving. I think you should too. Women, gathering, and the invisible architecture of survival here is a thing that took me years, embarrassingly, honestly, years to really understand. The majority of the food that kept our ancestors alive for most of human prehistory was collected by women. Not some of the food, not the easy or unimportant food. The majority, the daily, reliable, caloric backbone of hunter-gatherer subsistence. Gathering, the collection of plant foods, tubers, seeds, nuts, berries, eggs, shellfish, small animals, insects, has been systematically undervalued in the historical and popular understanding of early human survival for reasons that are not difficult to trace if you look at who was writing the history and when. The paradigm of man the hunter, which held enormous sway over paleoanthropology and popular science from roughly the 1960s through the 1980s, framed hunting as the central driver of human evolution and gathering as the supplementary, secondary, feminine background. Feminist anthropologists, beginning in the 1970s and gathering force through the 1980s and 1990s, systematically dismantled this framing, and the current scientific consensus has moved far from it. But I want to be specific about what this means in practice, because vague gestures toward gathering was also important don't do justice to what gathering actually involved. Consider the extraction of underground storage organs, tubers, corms, bulbs, rhizomes, which constitute a major caloric resource for hunter-gatherers in many environments, particularly in Africa. This is not a simple food source. These plants invest heavily in underground storage as a defense against surface predation. To locate them, a gatherer must know which surface signals, a particular leaf structure, a specific wilting pattern, the shadow of a climbing vine, indicate the presence of an underground organ, and what the seasonal timing of those signals means for when the organ will be at its most caloric. To extract them, she must dig, often with a digging stick in hard, dry, compacted laterite soil, sometimes for a foot or more for a single tuber. And she must know which ones are edible and which are toxic, because many plants in the same families are not edible, and the consequences of guessing wrong range from vomiting to death. Kristen Hawkes from the University of Utah has done groundbreaking work on the role of gathering, specifically the extraordinary gathering efficiency of older women in human evolution. Her grandmother hypothesis, developed through fieldwork with the Hadza of Tanzania in the 1980s and 1990s, proposes that the extended post-reproductive lifespan of human women, which is unusual among primates, evolved specifically because the food provisioning capacity of grandmothers was so beneficial to the survival of their grandchildren that it provided a genuine evolutionary advantage. In other words, grandmothers are why humans live past menopause. The Hadza data Hawks collected showed that post-reproductive women were, calorie for calorie, the most productive foragers in the group. They knew more about where the food was. They had decades of accumulated knowledge about which patches were reliable in which seasons, which processing techniques unlocked the most nutrition from which plants, where the water sources were in the lean seasons. And critically, they directed that production toward feeding their daughters' children, their grandchildren, rather than having more children of their own. The survival of human children, in other words, has been partially underwritten by the knowledge and labor of grandmothers for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe longer. If you have grandparents, if you had grandparents who helped raise you, who fed you, who showed up with food when your parents were exhausted, you may be a direct beneficiary of one of the oldest social contracts in human evolutionary history. I want to tell you about a specific place and a specific set of people, because I've been speaking in generalizations for a while, and I think the specific always does things the general can't. The Clayses River site, on the southern Cape Coast of South Africa, near what is now the town of Humansdorp, is one of the most important archaeological sites on the planet for understanding early Homo sapiens survival. It was occupied intermittently over a period spanning from approximately 120,000 to 60,000 years ago, which places its earliest occupants comfortably within the time frame of anatomically modern humans. The site is a system of sea caves in the cliff face above the Indian Ocean, and the people who lived there were exploiting one of the richest and most reliable food environments in the human story: the ocean. This is, on reflection, obvious but often overlooked. The coast, particularly the rocky coastline of southern Africa, is an extraordinarily productive food environment for humans. Shellfish, mussels, limpets, barnacles, chitons grow in vast concentrations in the intertidal zone and are available year-round. They don't run away. They don't require weapons to collect. They don't need to be tracked. They just need to be picked up at low tide by anyone with the knowledge of when the tides come and the dexterity to pry them loose. Hilary Deacon, a South African archaeologist who did much of the foundational work at Clayses River beginning in the 1960s, found the cave floors packed with shellfish middens, accumulated deposits of shell and bone and ash representing continuous habitation and continuous shellfish exploitation. He found evidence of controlled fire, hearths, charred bone, charred plant material. He found bone tools. He found ochre, the red iron oxide pigment that may have been used for body decoration or symbolic marking. He also found something that, when I read about it for the first time, sat with me for days. He found evidence in the faunal assemblage, the collection of animal bones, of what appears to be sophisticated, coordinated large game hunting as early as 120,000 years ago. Specifically, remains of Cape buffalo, eland, and other large, dangerous animals that show evidence of butchering by stone tools. Cape buffalo kill about 200 people a year in Africa today. They are, by almost any measure, one of the most dangerous animals on the continent, powerful, aggressive, unpredictable, and capable of turning on a pursuer. To hunt them 120,000 years ago, without firearms, without metal, with wooden spears tipped with stone or bone, that required coordinated group effort, detailed knowledge of the animal's behavior, the ability to plan and communicate a strategy, and the acceptance of real, serious risk. The people who did this had names. They had families. They had disputes and affections, and the particular knowledge that this specific Cape buffalo, seen grazing in this specific hollow, could be moved from that hollow by a group approaching from the downwind side toward the waiting members of the group positioned above. They were us, not like us, anatomically modern humans with the same brain, the same emotional and cognitive capacity, the same capacity for fear and joy and calculation. They were having the specific experience of being alive that you are having right now, in every way that matters. They just didn't have your comfortable room. Weapons and the archaeology of ingenuity. Let me talk for a while about the technology of killing, because it's worth understanding what ingenuity looks like when it's operating under maximum pressure. The earliest stone tools that we've found belong to what archaeologists call the Olduvai industry, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where they were first extensively studied by Louis and Mary Leakey. These tools date to approximately 2.6 million years ago and consist, essentially, of rocks that have been struck with other rocks to produce a sharp edge. They are not elaborate. You might look at one and not immediately recognize it as human-made. But they are the result of a specific cognitive operation. You must see the potential shape inside the rock, and you must understand how to strike the rock in the correct place and at the correct angle to produce the shape you want. Mary Leakey, who spent decades meticulously excavating and categorizing these tools from the Olduvai deposits, described the process by which she came to recognize them. By the specific pattern of flaking, the deliberateness of the conchoidal fractures, the presence of what she called Hertzian cones, the characteristic conical fracture pattern produced by a controlled impact on the rock's surface. Her 1971 book Olduvai Gorge remains one of the foundational texts of African prehistory, and the meticulous detail with which she documented these early tools, drawing every one, measuring every flake, noting every context, is a model of archaeological patience that shaped a generation of researchers. The Acheulean industry, which developed approximately 1.76 million years ago and persisted in various forms until as recently as 130,000 years ago, a span of time that makes the entirety of recorded history look like a Tuesday afternoon, produced the hand axe. The Acheulean hand axe is one of the most made things in human history. They have been found on every continent except Australia and Antarctica, in quantities that almost defy comprehension, hundreds of thousands of individual specimens, in deposits sometimes so dense that they're described as hand axe caches. For well over 1 million years, this was the signature technology of a branch of our lineage. The symmetry of a well-made Acheulean hand axe is precise and beautiful. Researchers have argued about this beauty. Why should a utilitarian cutting tool be symmetrical? Symmetry is not necessary for cutting. A lopsided flaked stone with a sharp edge cuts just as well as a perfectly oval bifacial tool. And yet the hominins who made these tools over this extraordinary span of time kept making them symmetrical. Some researchers, including Merck Cohn and Stephen Mithen, have proposed the sexy hand axe hypothesis. that Acheulean hand axes were, at least in part, displays of cognitive and physical skill, the hominin equivalent of a peacock's tail, demonstrating to potential mates and social competitors that this individual could produce, from nothing but a rock and another rock, a precisely symmetrical, high-quality tool. The ability to make a good hand axe required years of practice, a clear mental template, fine motor control, strength, and patience. Displaying that ability may have been socially advantageous in ways that went beyond mere utility. If that's true, and I want to be honest, it's an interesting hypothesis rather than established fact, then the first art may have predated the first paintings by well over 1 million years. The first thing humans made beautiful, because beauty itself was survival, may have been a stone axe. By the time we reach the Middle Stone Age in Africa, roughly 300,000 to 50,000 years ago, the technological picture has become genuinely impressive. At sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa, excavated by Curtis Marion of Arizona State University and his colleagues, we find evidence of behaviors that push back the date of what archaeologists call behavioral modernity, significantly earlier than was thought possible even 20 years ago. Pinnacle Point 13B, a cave site on a cliff face above the Indian Ocean, preserves evidence dating to approximately 164,000 years ago of human use of ochre for what appears to be symbolic purpose. Not functional purpose, not using ochre as a preservative or insect repellent, though it can be used for both. Symbolic purpose, processing ochre into a fine powder in quantities, and with techniques that suggest intentional pigment production for application to surfaces or bodies. The same site preserves evidence of shellfish exploitation, both the collection and the cooking of marine invertebrates, at this very early date, implying that coastal resource use as a systematic survival strategy is much older than we thought. But here's the detail that stops me cold every time I encounter it. The shellfish were being harvested not randomly, but in a pattern that corresponds to the lunar cycle. Specifically, the shell size distribution, which in shellfish reflects the season and tidal conditions of harvest, shows peaks corresponding to spring tides, which occur during new and full moons, which means these humans 164,000 years ago were tracking the moon. We're knowing without calendars, without writing, that in some days the tide will go out farther and the shellfish will be more accessible, and we're planning their foraging accordingly. The moon was already a practical tool before it was a symbol, though it was probably both at the same time. The spear. I want to spend a moment on the spear, because the spear is where a lot of survival threads converge. The oldest unambiguous wooden spears ever found were recovered from a brown coal mine in Schöningen, Germany, in the 1990s. Excavations led by Hartmut Thiem uncovered 8 wooden throwing spears, along with the remains of more than 10 butchered horses, in waterlogged sediments dating to approximately 300,000 years ago. The Schöningen spears are extraordinary objects, up to 2.3 meters long, made from spruce wood, weighted and balanced in a way that mimics modern javelins, with the center of gravity in the front third of the spear, which is the design principle of an effective throwing weapon. They were not prodding sticks. They were projectile weapons made by someone who understood, in a functional, if not a theoretical way, the physics of throwing. Those spears were made, most likely, by Homo heidelbergensis, an archaic human species ancestral to both Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens. and the horses they killed in that waterlogged meadow 300,000 years ago were not small animals. Wild horses of the Pleistocene were large, powerful, unpredictable. Hunting them with wooden spears required coordination, strategy, probably specialized knowledge of horse behavior, and the willingness to stand close enough to throw. The people who hunted those horses are beyond memory, but the spears are real. The spears are still there. And I think there is something important in that, in the fact that a thing made to keep someone alive in a moment of absolute necessity is still in the world 300,000 years later, preserved by accident in the cold mud of a vanished German lake. The person who gripped that spear is gone. The act of throwing it is gone. The moment is absolutely and irrecoverably gone. But the object persists, and from the object we can read, if we're careful and patient and willing to listen, something of the life. Ambient, a brief pause, the day sounds continue, something large, a bird maybe passes. The world is active and present. The body what the flesh remembers. I want to talk about pain for a while, not in a grim or gratuitous way, but because I think that when we talk about early human survival, we tend to unconsciously filter out the physical reality of it, the specific, unmediated experience of living in a body that has no access to medicine, no access to surgery, no access to anesthesia, and that is, by the end of most lives, carrying a significant accumulation of damage. Paleopathology, the study of disease and injury in ancient populations, primarily through examination of skeletal remains, gives us a window into this that is both sobering and, in an odd way, humanizing. Let me start with teeth, because teeth tell so many stories and we rarely think about them. The pre-agricultural diet of hunter-gatherers was, by most measures, good for teeth, lower in the simple carbohydrates that feed the bacteria responsible for cavity-forming acid production, and including tough, fibrous foods that acted as natural abrasives, keeping the tooth surfaces clean. Surveys of Paleolithic dental remains generally show lower rates of dental caries, cavities, than you see in agricultural populations. But what pre-agricultural teeth do show is extensive wear. Extraordinary wear by modern standards. In skeletal samples from groups with a heavy reliance on stone-ground grains or on tough, fibrous foods, the enamel can be worn to the dentin, the sensitive inner layer, by middle age. By the time someone in a pre-agricultural society was 50, if they lived that long, their teeth might be worn nearly to the gum line. What does that mean experientially? It means a chronic, worsening difficulty eating certain foods. It means dental abscesses, painful, potentially life-threatening, when worn teeth expose the pulp to infection. It means that the experience of eating, which is the central survival activity of every living creature, becomes progressively more difficult and painful across a lifetime. One of the most poignant skeletal specimens I've encountered in the paleopathological literature is described by paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkhaus in his work on Neanderthal remains. The skeleton known as Shanidar I, a Neanderthal man recovered from Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan by Ralph Solke in the 1950s, and dating to approximately 45,000 years ago, shows evidence of what Trinkhaus describes as remarkable levels of healing injury. His right arm had been amputated or severely damaged at the elbow at some point, and the arm had healed, meaning he survived the initial injury. He had arthritic degeneration in his right knee and ankle. He may have had a traumatic head injury that resulted in partial blindness in his left eye. He was, by any measure, significantly disabled, and yet he lived. He lived to an age that Trinkhaus estimated at between 35 and 50, which for a Neanderthal male was genuinely old age. He was not abandoned. He was cared for, he must have been, because a one-armed, partially blind, arthritic individual in a hunting-dependent group cannot survive without support. Someone fed him. Someone probably helped him move when the group moved. Someone decided, every day for years, that this specific individual was worth the cost of keeping alive. That decision is not survival in the narrow, selfish gene sense. That decision is something else. That decision is the beginning of something I want to call compassion, though I'm aware that word carries freight I can't fully control. There's a debate in paleoanthropology about how old care for the disabled is. Some researchers, like Penny Spickens of the University of York, have argued that the evidence for caregiving in ancient populations, not just in Neanderthals, but going back to Homo heidelbergensis and possibly further, suggests that compassion, in the practical sense of choosing to help individuals who cannot fully help themselves, is ancient. Not a recent moral innovation, but a deep evolutionary tendency. The evidence includes Shanidar 1, but also a range of other specimens. An elderly Homo heidelbergensis individual from the Cima de los Huesos site in the Atapuerca hills of northern Spain, dating to approximately 430,000 years ago, shows evidence of a developmental abnormality in his skull that would have affected his physical appearance significantly and may have impaired his mobility. He was kept alive for years. A Homo erectus individual from D. Manasee, Georgia, dating to approximately 1.77 million years ago, known as the D. Manasee toothless skull, was an elderly individual who had lost virtually all his teeth long before death, with bone regrowth covering the now useless tooth sockets. Without teeth, he could not process most foods, but he survived. Someone helped him eat. This is 1.77 million years ago. At 1.77 million years ago, something in a small group of hominins in what is now the Caucasus decided not to let the old one starve. That is not nothing. That is not what you do if survival is purely about maximizing individual reproductive success. That's what you do when something has gone wrong with the equation, when something has gotten into the organism that can override simple self-interest. Whatever that something is, we've been carrying it for at least 1.77 million years. Childbirth and the survival of becoming here is a fact about human biology that is worth sitting with. Giving birth for a human female is dramatically more dangerous than it is for any other primate. This is not a minor difference in risk. It is a structural, anatomical difference with profound consequences. The problem is simple to state. The human infant's head is very large, and the human female pelvis is constrained by the requirements of efficient bipedal locomotion. The birth canal is narrow. The infant's skull is wide. The passage of a large-brained infant through a narrow pelvis is an event that, without assistance, kills a significant proportion of mothers and infants. It killed a much larger proportion in the past, before any of the obstetric interventions we now take for granted. Anthropologist Wenda Trevathan of New Mexico State University has argued that this obstetric crisis, this mismatch between brain size and birth canal, is the evolutionary driver behind one of the most consistent and universal behaviors in human birth, the presence of attendants. Across every culture ever documented, in every environment, across all of recorded history, and deep into the unrecorded past, human birth has almost always been attended. Someone is there. Someone helps. This is so ubiquitous that it tends to go unremarked, but it is genuinely unusual from a primate perspective. Most primates give birth alone and give birth easily without assistance. Human birth is an event that almost always requires a helper, and that helper in most cultures and most of history has been female, experienced, and knowledgeable. The midwife is, by this argument, one of the oldest and most essential specializations in human society. Not a profession in the modern sense, a role, a knowledge, a responsibility passed from experienced women to less experienced women across the entirety of human existence. Long before there were doctors, long before there were hospitals, long before there was medicine in any formal sense, there was the woman who knew how to help another woman give birth. The specific knowledge required is not trivial. Understanding the stages of labor, knowing when a presentation is normal and when it isn't. Knowing what position helps, knowing when the cord is a problem and how to address it, knowing how to manage a placenta that doesn't deliver cleanly, knowing from the long pattern of a labor when something is going wrong before it becomes catastrophic. This knowledge, accumulated through generations of attendants, through watching, through doing, was oral. It was carried in memory and in the hands of practitioners who had learned from practitioners who had learned from practitioners stretching back into the deep past. It was, in every society, precious knowledge. It was the knowledge that kept birth from being a consistently lethal event. And then in the 19th and early 20th century in Europe and North America, hospital birth took over, and that knowledge was almost entirely displaced, in a generation, by a medical culture that initially didn't include hand washing, and whose early obstetric mortality rates in hospitals were, for a period, actually worse than home birth mortality rates because of hospital-acquired infection. Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian physician who in the 1840s figured out that childbed fever, puerperal fever, which was killing women at rates of 10 to 35% in some maternity wards, was being transmitted on the unwashed hands of doctors moving between the autopsy room and the delivery room, was ignored, ridiculed, and eventually committed to a psychiatric institution, where he died 14 days after admission, possibly from an infection. Possibly from the same bacterial infection he had spent his career trying to prevent. He was right. He was always right. And it cost him his life, and it cost thousands of women their lives, that the right answer was suppressed because it was uncomfortable. This is a story about early human survival in only an indirect way. But it's a story about how the accumulated knowledge of generations can be lost, or suppressed, or disregarded in ways that are lethal, and about how the specific, hard-won knowledge of how to keep a person alive through an acute physical crisis is never trivial, and never obvious, and deserves respect that it doesn't always get. What we ate and what it did to us. Let me talk about diet in a real, specific way, because it's one of the most contested and most misunderstood aspects of early human survival. The Paleolithic diet, the diet of our pre-agricultural ancestors, has been idealized in certain popular health movements in ways that are both interesting and, in important respects, misleading. The paleo diet, as marketed today, implies a specific, protein-heavy, grain-free, dairy-free diet that is supposed to mimic what our ancestors ate, and therefore what our bodies are designed for. Setting aside the question of whether evolution operates as designer, the factual problem with this framework is that what our ancestors ate was wildly, dramatically variable depending on when, where, and who they were. Hunter-gatherers at the coast of South Africa ate mostly shellfish and marine mammals and some plant matter. Hunter-gatherers in Arctic environments ate mostly animal fat and protein, and almost no plant matter at all. Hunter-gatherers in tropical rainforests ate primarily plant matter and insects, with some hunted meat. Hunter-gatherers in the productive savannas of East Africa ate a mix that shifted with season and location. There is no single ancestral diet. There was the diet that was available in this place, in this season, with these skills, in these social conditions. And the pattern across all of those specific diets is not uniformity but flexibility. What we can say with some confidence is this: the pre-agricultural diet was generally high in fiber, low in processed carbohydrates, and nutritionally diverse. It typically included a wide variety of plant species. Some estimates suggest traditional hunter-gatherer diets may have included 50 to 150 distinct plant species over the course of a year, which provided a breadth of micronutrients that modern agricultural diets struggle to match. And it was often not enough. This is the part that the idealization of ancestral eating tends to skip. Hunger was real. Seasonal food scarcity was real. The period between the depletion of last season's resources and the availability of the next season's was a genuine survival challenge in many environments. There's a reason hungry season is a concept across virtually every traditional subsistence society. It names a real annual crisis, a period when stored food is depleted and new food isn't yet available, when people eat less, when children are most vulnerable, when the elderly are most at risk. That hunger was not romantic. It was a physiological experience, the specific, grinding experience of caloric deficit, the fatigue, the cognitive slowing, the irritability, the progressive weakening that makes everything harder. It happened every year. In bad years, it was worse. In very bad years, people starved, and they kept going. They kept foraging in the lean season, kept nursing infants, kept tending fires, kept making plans, with less energy in their bodies than they needed, pushing through on metabolic reserves that were never quite adequate because the alternative was to stop. I think this is worth holding alongside the more epic and dramatic elements of early human survival. The big hunt, the fire making, the dangerous scavenge from under the nose of a predator, those are the dramatic moments. But the actual texture of survival was often just this: not enough food and continuing anyway, getting up every morning in the hungry season and going out to find something. Anything, enough to keep going one more day. That quiet persistence is the real engine of survival, not heroism, persistence. Parasites and pathogens. The invisible war. There is one aspect of early human survival that I want to address directly, because it tends to get left out of the romanticized accounts, and leaving it out distorts the picture significantly. The pre-agricultural human body was inhabited not just by the usual symbiotic gut flora that we all carry, but by a range of parasites, intestinal worms, external parasites, blood parasites, in quantities and varieties that would be considered shocking by modern standards. Carl Reinhard, a paleoparasitologist from the University of Nebraska, has spent his career examining ancient fecal samples, coprolites and sediment from latrine deposits, from archaeological sites ranging from Paleolithic Europe to pre-Columbian North America. His work reveals a picture of parasitic burden that is sobering: hookworm, roundworm, tapeworm, pinworm, whipworm. In high-density or seasonally restricted populations, infestation rates approaching 100% are not unusual. In less dense populations, rates of 30 to 60% are common. Parasitic infection is not neutral. Intestinal worms, even when not acutely life-threatening, cause chronic caloric and micronutrient loss. They eat what you eat before your body can fully absorb it. Heavy infestations cause anemia, malnutrition in children already on the edge of adequate intake, stunted growth, cognitive impairment. The energetic cost of carrying a significant parasite load over years is not trivial. In populations already living close to the nutritional margin, it is a real and ongoing drag on survival. And this is before we get to bacterial infections, viral infections, or the great epidemic diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, which were largely absent from the small, mobile groups of the Paleolithic, but which devastated populations once settlement, agriculture, and dense living created the conditions for epidemic spread. The story of infectious disease and human population is one of the most important stories in our species' history, and I'll return to it in more detail later in this video. The point I want to make here is simpler. The pre-agricultural body was a battleground, continuously, between the human organism and an enormous variety of other organisms trying to make a living off it. The immune system, which is one of the most complex biological systems in existence, evolved under exactly this pressure, the relentless selection for better defense against exactly these organisms. The specific shape of your immune system, the specific cells and proteins and signaling cascades that defend you every moment of your life, all of it was forged in the fire of that ancient, ongoing war. You are the product of millions of immune victories. Every ancestor who survived a fever survived because something in their body found the answer in time, and that answer is in you now. Community, the technology of each other, every single thing I've told you so far, the fire, the hunting, the gathering, the birth, the survival of the injured has one thing underneath it: other people. There is no human survival without community. It's not a nice addition to the story. It's the precondition of the story. Strip away the social group, and what you have is a single hominin standing alone in an African landscape in the dark. And that's not a story with a long ending. I want to spend this chapter talking about what early human community actually looked like, not the idealized version, not the brutalized, nasty, brutish, and short version, but the specific, complicated, warm, and difficult reality of it. Let's start with size. Robin Dunbar, an anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist at Oxford, developed in the early 1990s what has come to be known as Dunbar's number, the hypothesis that there is a cognitive limit on the number of stable social relationships a human brain can maintain, and that this limit is approximately 150 individuals. He derived this number from the correlation between neocortex size and social group size across primate species, and then applied it to humans. He found that groups of approximately 150 show up repeatedly across a wide range of human social contexts: villages in traditional societies, military units, corporate organizational structures, church congregations, as a natural threshold above which the social cohesion of a group begins to break down without formal hierarchical structures to hold it together. The band, the basic unit of hunter-gatherer social organization, was typically much smaller than 150, usually between 20 and 50 individuals. These bands were embedded in larger networks of related bands. Dunbar calls them clans and tribes at increasing scales, who shared language, kinship, and cultural identity, and who cooperated in specific contexts. The 150 number may represent the tribe level, the network of people you know personally and can call on in a crisis, rather than the immediate residential group. But the band itself, the 20 to 50 people you actually lived with, slept near, foraged with, depended on every day, that group was the survival unit. And the relationships inside that group were complex, intimate, and absolutely fundamental. Let me tell you about the economics of the band, because it's nothing like what we might assume from a modern economic perspective. In a hunter-gatherer band, the economy is what anthropologist Marshall Solins famously called, in his 1966 essay, A Stone Age Economics, though his specific argument was the opposite of what that phrase might suggest. What Solins argued, based on analysis of the Kung and other groups, is that hunter-gatherers were not primitive economies scraping along at the edge of subsistence. They were, in important respects, economies of abundance, not because they had a lot, but because they wanted little and spent far less time in subsistence activities than modern industrial workers spend in wage labor. The Kung, by Lee's calculations, worked approximately 12 to 19 hours per week in food-getting activities. The rest of their time was spent sleeping, socializing, playing, visiting, and resting. Solins, somewhat provocatively, called this the original affluent society. This has been debated and qualified significantly since 1966. The leisure time figures probably undercount time spent in food processing, tool making, camp maintenance, and child care. The affluence is relative to need rather than absolute. And life in hunter-gatherer societies, as I've made clear, included real hardship, disease, injury, hunger, the death of children. It was not a paradise, but there's something in Solins' observation that is worth holding. The specifically modern assumption that more is always better, that accumulation is the goal, that status comes from ownership. These are not universal human values. They are historically contingent values associated with specific economic arrangements that are themselves quite recent. The hunter-gatherer value system tends, rather, toward sharing, toward sufficiency, toward the social over the material, not as an ethical choice imposed from outside, as a practical necessity that shaped values over long generations. If you accumulated food in a hunter-gatherer band, you had a problem. It would spoil before you could eat it. There was no storage technology that reliably preserved food for more than a few days in most environments. If you accumulated objects, you had a different problem. You had to carry them when the group moved, and the group moved often. In most environments, every few days to every few weeks, depending on resource availability. Under these conditions, accumulation is not adaptive. Sharing is adaptive. Giving is adaptive. Reputation for generosity is adaptive, because the person who gives freely in good times is more likely to receive when times are bad. And in a world where times are bad regularly and unpredictably, that insurance network, that web of reciprocal obligation built up through years of sharing, is one of the most valuable things you can have. You can't store meat, but you can store goodwill. There is a practice documented in the ethnographic literature on hunter-gatherers that I think is one of the most quietly sophisticated economic inventions in human history, and it has no museum, no monument, and almost no name outside of anthropology. It's called demand sharing or tolerated scrounging, and it works like this. In many hunter-gatherer groups, the social norm around food, especially hunted food, is not that the person who acquired it owns it and may distribute it at their discretion. The norm, rather, is that anyone in the group has the right to ask for a share of available food, and refusal is a serious social violation. The hunter returns with meat, and members of the group approach and ask, sometimes directly, sometimes through the medium of intense and visible attention, and the hunter distributes it. The distribution follows kinship lines, reciprocal obligations, and individual need in ways that are sophisticated and situationally varying. But the baseline rule is, available food is community food. This seems economically irrational from the perspective of individual self-interest. Why work hard to acquire food if you're going to have to give most of it away? The answer is that in an environment of high hunting uncertainty, where any given hunt has maybe a 20 to 30% success rate, the insurance value of being part of a community where you will be fed on days you don't succeed is greater than the value of keeping your share on the days you do. It's a mutual insurance system, enforced by social norms, that smooths out the tremendous variance in individual resource acquisition. And here's the beautiful and somewhat startling thing. It's mathematically modeled by researchers like Bruce Winterholder at UC Davis to be genuinely efficient under the conditions hunter-gatherers actually live in. It's not just altruistic, it's adaptive. The sharing norm exists because it works. It keeps people alive. You are, in some deep sense, the product of people who shared. Because the ones who didn't share either starved when their luck ran bad, or were excluded from the group, or were eaten, there's anthropological evidence for conflict-based violence in the deep past, and groups that maintained internal cohesion through norms of sharing and reciprocity survived in ways that groups fractured by hoarding did not. Language. When we learn to tell each other no aspect of the human survival story is more contested and more important than language. When did we develop it? What did the first language sound like? What did it allow us to do that we couldn't do before? The problem is that language leaves almost no direct archaeological trace. You can't fossilize a word. You can look at the anatomy of the vocal tract, which requires inference from skeletal structures, particularly the hyoid bone, the small floating bone in the throat that anchors tongue muscles, and get some indication of whether an individual had the physical capacity for complex speech. You can look at brain endocasts, the internal casts of skull cavities that preserve impressions of brain surface anatomy, and identify the presence or absence of Broca's area and Wernicke's area, the brain regions most associated with language processing. But these are imprecise instruments. The hyoid bone of Neanderthals, recovered from the Kebara Cave site in Israel, a Neanderthal individual dating to about 60,000 years ago, known as Kebara II or the Moshe Kebara skeleton, excavated in 1983, is essentially identical in shape to a modern human hyoid. The Neanderthal inner ear, which processes sound, appears to have been tuned to the frequency range of human speech. The Neanderthal brain, while differently shaped from modern human brains, was of comparable size and showed asymmetry patterns associated with language lateralization. Most researchers today believe that Neanderthals had some form of spoken language. What they don't agree on is whether that language was fully comparable to modern human language in its expressive power, its syntactic complexity, its ability to convey abstract ideas. For modern Homo sapiens, the current consensus puts the development of fully modern language capability at somewhere between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, though some researchers, following evidence for behavioral modernity and symbolic thought, push for a more recent emergence around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago. But I want to step back from the dating debate for a moment and talk about what language means for survival, specifically, what it meant for early humans to be able to tell each other things that were not immediately present. Language is remarkable for many reasons, but one of the things that makes it specifically, powerfully useful for survival is what the philosopher Daniel Dennett calls the displacement of information, the ability to communicate about things that are not here, not now. Animals communicate in the present tense. A vervet monkey alarm call says predator now. A waggle dance says food that direction. These are functionally powerful, but they're limited to the immediately relevant moment. Human language can say, last season when we were north of the Third River, there were enormous concentrations of tubers in the places where the black-stemmed grass grows. The black-stemmed grass is flowering now. If we go north, we might find the same tubers. That sentence, or the functional equivalent of that sentence, at whatever level of syntactic sophistication our ancestors had, is survival technology of the highest order. It transmits a memory. It transmits a prediction. It connects a past observation to a present opportunity. It allows the knowledge of one person, accumulated through experience, to become the knowledge of the group. And it allows that knowledge to persist in memory and retelling across time, to be transmitted from one generation to the next, from grandparent to grandchild, long after the specific experience that generated it is gone. This is what Polly Wiesner's campfire story data is really about. Those nighttime stories around the fire, the stories of ancestors, of distant places, of great events, are the mechanism by which accumulated human knowledge traveled in time before writing. They're the original archive, the original library, the specific, portable, socially maintained technology by which a species with no writing and no storage could still, over generations, build up a body of accumulated knowledge so large and so sophisticated that it would eventually, in the right conditions, produce everything we know. Every piece of knowledge you have that isn't from your own direct experience, every piece of history, every scientific principle, every cultural norm, every recipe, every religious belief, every ethical precept came to you through language, through the specific chain of transmission that began around campfires in the dark, hundreds of thousands of years ago. You are listening right now, and in doing so, you're participating in the oldest technology we have. Conflict, violence, and the price of community. I want to be honest with you about something that I've been circling around, because I think the honest version of human survival requires it. Early human groups were not peaceful. They were not universally cooperative and harmonious. Violence, both within groups and between groups, was a real and significant feature of early human life, and it had real survival costs and real survival benefits, depending on context and perspective. The archaeological evidence for interpersonal violence goes back a very long way. A skull from a site near Atapuerca in Spain, the skull of a Homo heidelbergensis individual, designated cranium 17, dated to approximately 430,000 years ago, shows two depressed fracture wounds on the frontal bone, both consistent with blows from the same instrument to the same region of the skull in two distinct blows. The angle of the wounds, analyzed by Nohemi Sala and colleagues in a 2015 study in PLOS1, is inconsistent with a fall or accident, and consistent with deliberate, repeated blows to the head of an individual who was upright when struck. This is, by the evidence, the oldest documented case of lethal interpersonal violence in the hominin fossil record. 430,000 years ago. 2 blows to the head. Someone killed another person. Violence between groups, what we might call warfare in its most basic form, is evidenced in various sites across the Paleolithic and intensifies markedly with the transition to agriculture and settled life. The site of Crow Creek in South Dakota, dating to approximately 1325 CE, represents the largest pre-Columbian massacre site in North America, a mass grave of approximately 486 individuals, men, women, and children, showing evidence of systematic scalping, mutilation, and dismemberment. But even well before agriculture, evidence for group-on-group violence exists. The Nataruk site in Kenya, published in 2016 by Marta Murazan-Lar of Cambridge and colleagues in Nature, documents a massacre of at least 27 individuals, including women and children, dating to approximately 10,000 years ago, at the very end of the pre-agricultural period. I want to be careful here, because this evidence has been used by some researchers to argue for a sort of man is wolf to man theory of deep human nature, and by others to argue that violence was minimal before agriculture created the conditions for warfare. Both of these extreme positions are, based on the current evidence, probably wrong. The actual picture is more complicated. Early human groups engaged in both cooperation and conflict, both within groups and between them in contextually variable ways. Violence was real, but so was the sharing, the care of the injured, the grandmother feeding the grandchildren, the midwife at the birth, the old woman watching through the fire at night. The human capacity for violence and the human capacity for profound care and cooperation coexist in the same species, in the same communities, sometimes in the same individuals. They have always coexisted. Understanding early human survival honestly means holding both of those things at once, not resolving the tension into a clean narrative about either fallen brutality or noble innocence, but sitting with the full, complicated, contradictory truth of what we are. We are the animal that can kill a stranger and care for a crippled elder in the same week. We always have been, and somehow, out of that contradiction, we kept going.